Thank you, Sue, for the introduction that I couldn't hear. Yeah, I'm a senior quality engineer at driveway.com. I'm here in Portland, Oregon. Driveway is owned by Lithia Motors. We're pretty new. We're an e-commerce site for car shopping. And I work on one of the first sets of pages that you see. I work on the search engine. Driveway is new. We've went live with our first publicly facing web app about a year ago. We're growing very quickly. It's an exciting place to work because it's some new problem spaces for me. And we're really just kind of getting started with our test processes. So a little bit about me also, which will provide some context. I have been working in software quality for almost 20 years. And I consider myself a Selenium guy. I've used Selenium off and on since Selenium 1 was in beta in 2008. I've been to a couple of the Selenium conferences over the years. But I've also expanded my skill set beyond that. I've done some microservice test automation. I've basically tested up and down the stack. What I enjoy most is test automation, although I do get involved in Agile software or Agile testing processes and things as well. So I have recently been learning Cypress. I'm new to Cypress. Cypress is kind of the newcomer, kind of competing against Selenium, if you will. I started using it a little bit at my last company, and then when I started at Driveway in March, they already had a few tests written in Cypress. They wanted someone to take it over, build in some best practices, and make recommendations to the team at how best to use this tool. So I dove into learning Cypress, and I found, even before I started Driveway, actually, that the best practices in the Cypress community directly contradict everything I've learned about building end-to-end suites in Selenium. So this talk is about that dichotomy and what I'm doing to reconcile it right now. So I'm going to share my screen for my slides, and we'll dive in. So this talk is titled Page Objects or Application Actions in Cypress. Page objects coming from the Selenium world, application actions coming from the Cypress world. So I will walk you through first an overview of the two tools. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I'll have to go into a little bit. And then we'll do a deeper dive on the Cypress best practices and what the Cypress community is advocating here. And then when I found a conflict there, at least what I perceived to be a conflict, I did conducted some research on those practices to find out if I was missing something. And then I will end on how I'm resolving that controversy for my team and some conclusions I've drawn from this research. So an overview of the two tools. So Selenium, you probably know, has been around quite a while now. It's pretty well established. It's very well documented. It's widely used internationally. It's almost really the go-to, or probably is the go-to for automated end-to-end testing. It actually replaced the commercially provided kind of large-scale automation tools. It's pretty much replaced that as long as you know how to code. It's more lighter weight and gives you more control. Cypress is increasingly getting adopted. I don't actually have any numbers on that, but it's more of a sense of where I see it in job descriptions when I've been, looking at job descriptions and just knowing a little bit about the Portland market. It's increasingly getting picked up, and you can run across teams that are just doing Cypress and not doing Selenium. First, a bit about Selenium. I just mentioned this first bullet is almost a standard at this point. And actually, its protocol actually is a standard now. Its best practices are very well documented. They tend to center around object-oriented design principles, and specifically that's page objects, or more officially called the page object model. It's a necessary design pattern for having tests that are easy to maintain. However, what goes along with Selenium also is there's a bit of a learning curve to learn how to use it. And there you can find among test engineers kind of a wide range of a long continuum of skills as to how well versed they are in Selenium or not, often depending on whether they've actually had to build their own test framework or have just kind of learned Selenium in the context of an existing framework, and then picking it up with their regular sprint duties. Its learning curve primarily revolves around two things, and these are things that developers don't typically learn. You really have to kind of dive into Selenium automation to really pick these up. The first one is called waiters, and what that means is when you're writing end-to-end tests, you've got the tests running on one side, the application running in the browser on the other side, and this is very unsynchronous, and you have to write the tests in a way so that it syncs up with the application being tested. So, for example, your test may go ahead and hit the page being tested, but then it needs to wait for that page to load. The test has to actually block and wait for the page to load. It might need to wait for, say, some input fields and maybe a submit button to show up. And you have to know how to code that. That's called waiters. Again, it's well documented in the Selenium world, but it's not always obvious to people when they first start out. And if you don't know how to do that, you get what's called flaky tests. This is actually a term that's frequently used, but what it means is tests that pass sometimes and fail others, or intermittent tests. Now, the other thing that you need to learn in the Selenium world is page objects for code maintenance. And I think I've got that on my next slide. Yes. So page objects are really used for test maintenance. A page object is usually a class, assuming you're in an object-oriented language. And you write a class or a series of classes that correspond to the pages in the application you're developing, or even components within pages. And what you do is your test has to have what's called a locator. It's a piece of code that you write for finding the elements on the UI elements on the application that the test needs to interact with when it's simulating user actions, such as an input field. So you have a locator in the test, and you have, the actual, HTML DOM elements in the application, and the locator tells the test how to find those elements. So you can have a series of tests that, often you'll have several tests all testing different aspects of the same page, and perhaps all those tests need to interact with the same elements, like the same input fields, to trigger different actions, maybe on the next page or some other place on that particular page, but you have multiple tests using the same elements. So that means your locators would then be copied throughout your tests. Well, okay, so that may or may not be a problem, but what happens is when your applications change the UI and your locators now need to be updated, you then end up having to change all those in all your tests, in all your test cases. So to depending on how many test cases you have, that may or may not be a problem. But it ends up usually for large applications, it ends up being a problem that you're constantly updating tests rather than writing new tests, or solving actually finding investigating actual bugs. So how you handle that is you write a page object. The locators are all in one spot. When the application changes, you change the locators in one spot. The tests don't change at all. And so the page object serves as a middleware for managing those locators. You also, the methods in the page object also are a single place for storing the code that runs the user interactions that you're simulating. So that's page objects. If all of you on the call are already aware of page objects, then forgive me for explaining things that you know already, but I don't know who the audience is. So another thing that I think is huge with page objects is readability, in that when you have the page object, then your tests can read more like English, and it really helps when you're troubleshooting failed tests and wondering, is the problem that does the test need updating, or has the test actually caught a bug? Your test cases that can then read when they're calling methods from the page objects, they can read more like fill out the form and submit, rather than find the input field for first name, enter text, click button. It actually brings semantics into the test. So maintainability, we've already talked about. So now a bit about Cypress. So as I mentioned, it's rapidly gaining a following. It's an end-to-end test tool that's really written for front-end developers. More on that later. It's easier to get started. Flaky tests are less common because the waiters are built into the Cypress engine. And then, this assertions are also built into what the Cypress calls retriability. Whereas in Selenium, you code the assertions separately. That's more of a minor point for this talk, but it's a very cool feature of Cypress. What I found really is Selenium and Cypress seem to really, they're not only two different tools, and I should mention that Cypress has a really nice test runner. It really is easy for someone to get started without that learning curve, at least initially. As I'm getting deeper into Cypress, I find that eventually it catches up to you. But at least, it's easier for developers, when you're talking, all this talk about shift left testing, it's very easier for front end to developers just start writing end-to-end tests. Selenium, so two tools, two cultures. Selenium really comes out of kind of a Java, .NET, Python, object-oriented communities. Its original roots were in JavaScript, but quickly the OO community realized its value, picked it up, and heavily modified Selenium. And core Selenium is very embedded in the object-oriented world. Cypress appears to have been developed by actual front-end developers. It comes from the JavaScript community. And so it seems to have led to kind of, different kind of ways of thinking. So Cypress practices. The Cypress community, I was very surprised to find strongly recommends not using page objects. When I was first diving into Cypress, I did some searching on YouTube, and one of the first hits you'll probably see is a conference talk in 2018 by Brian Mann, who's the lead developer for Cypress. And very early in his talk, he says that page objects are an anti-pattern. So when I saw this, I thought, oh, interesting. Okay. That seems different than everything that I've been doing for many years. Is there a reason for this? Is there something about Cypress or something about JavaScript that I don't know? I decided to be open-minded about it, but my gut feeling was there was more to it than this. Regardless, it was raising a lot of questions for me. So anyway, what Mr. Mann does recommend is application actions. And what these are custom functions written in JavaScript for the test setup that call the JavaScript for the application's JavaScript as it's running in the browser directly. The nice thing about Cypress is it's much more directly integrated with the browser, and so you can actually from your test code modify the JavaScript code that runs the UI. And so he recommends using this technique for, say, if your test requires certain state to be set as part of the setup before the test can start running. He recommends coding it directly using application actions. But what Mr. Mann didn't mention is actually all the reasons why you use page objects to begin with. A single source of truth for these element locators, a single source of truth for coding the user's interactions with the elements, and test readability. And another point that got missed is that, in all honesty, so he's all talking about test setup, test setup, test setup, and he's basically saying don't use page objects for your test setup because they're really slow. They have to wait for the browser to catch up. You've got that waiting going on. Just your test setup, just set the state directly. Well, in all honesty, the Selenium community, for those that have experience building Selenium test suites, would recommend the same thing. What's often done in a Selenium test suite is usually you're not setting state directly in the browser's JavaScript, although you can with the exec script function, if I remember the name of it correctly. But usually Selenium testing is usually true end-to-end testing, and so they would probably set the state directly in the database, which is slower than doing it directly in the browser's JavaScript, but it's certainly faster than going through a bunch of pages, using page objects to go through a bunch of pages, filling out forms and things to get to the point that you're actually trying to test. Now, to Mr. Mann's credit, there are Selenium test suites that do it that way, but they're unnecessarily slow, and it's not considered a best practice. So again, after his talk, I was thinking, so should Cypress use page objects? Is there something I'm missing? Is there something with Cypress or JavaScript that makes using page objects just not necessary? I decided I needed to research this because, again, my role was to provide some best practices recommendations to my team, and I didn't feel fully comfortable just using my gut feeling on this. So I dove deeper and did some searching. I found quite a few blogs. A number of them are referenced in my paper. And I found that the blogs fell into one of three categories. A number of them basically restated Mr. Mann's talk. They recommend not using page objects. They imply that applications actions should replace them. Their reasons for using page objects, though, are not actually addressed. And this was interesting to me. On at least a couple of the blogs, I looked at the comments, and all the comments had the same questions that I'm having, that they're not actually addressing the reasons for using page objects. So now, if they had a response, say, we don't use page objects because even though the locators are copied, Cypress is so easy to work with that you can easily update the code and move on. That would be an argument that I could absorb and then evaluate further, but I never heard anything like that. Whoops, pardon me. Went the wrong way. So other blogs fell into these categories. Some blogs recommended page objects. These seem to be authors coming from the Selenium world, but they also ignored the controversy. Perhaps they hadn't seen the video. I don't know. And then other blogs were some really good blogs describing the trade-offs between Cypress and Selenium, but they also ignored this controversy. So how to resolve this? Well, I see it as unresolved. My research really showed me that no one has addressed this explicitly. So I thought, oh, here's an idea for a talk. I will. I found that that I could find no real reasons for not using page objects, and I still had all my original reasons for using them. So for my team, at least, I recommended that we use the page objects. I put together a demo for my front-end developers using some of their existing tests that had not used page objects, refactored those to use a page object, demoed it, and my developers liked the technique. I do like using the application actions for test setup if you can at all. It would be a lot faster even with connecting with a backend database. So I like that technique a lot. We're not using that on my team at the moment at Driveway, but that's simply because the pages we're testing are primarily read-only as long as we have data that is preceded. Then our tests can continue, and basically all the tests need that same setup. So there isn't specific test setups for individual tests per se. There is in terms of we are mocking some of the back end, but actually we're mocking all of the back end at the moment. But we're not needing application actions just yet. But it's a great technique, and I do intend to use it when I find an appropriate place to plug them in. So I just went through this. This is what my team is doing. We're using page objects. Other teams at Driveway are not yet. That's mostly because we're all so new. I started in March, and most of the other test engineers were hired on after I was. And we're all kind of coming from different skill sets and different experiences. So each team at the moment is kind of doing what they need to do for their immediate team needs. I think time will tell what happens, at some point in 2022, if some of the other teams that are just starting their Cypress code, if they decide later on that they do need the page objects for test maintenance. I've brought this up with the other testers, so they're all very, very aware of the issue. And I think probably at some point by the end of 2022, we will have concluded, yes, we really need page objects, or page objects are needed in some cases. I think it remains to be seen. But I do know on my team, we like them, and because our pages are likely to change a lot. The pages on the application being tested are likely to change a lot. We're very, very much invested in using page objects. Okay. So conclusions. From what I can see, the Cypress community does not address the reasons for using page objects. I think part of this might also be coming from the front-end JavaScript culture there, in that I find most front-end developers that are now well-versed in tools like React don't do a lot of OO coding. And so I think it's a part of it is cultural. It's interesting to me that from what I've seen so far, no one is pointing this out about whether page objects should be used or not. And it almost seems to be two different cultures. And the Cypress people recommending it appear to have come from the Selenium world. Page objects should be used for Cypress test suites, I feel. Application actions should be used for the test setup. Page object should not be used for test setup. Anyway, that's what I've learned, and I wanted to share with you. I appreciate you all listening, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to take questions via audio, since I can't hear any of you all. I am going to stop my screen share, though. If I can get back to Zoom.
Let's try a little test, Paul. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Not sure. There we go. And thank you very much for listening.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep,
Okay.
can hear you.
Susan, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I still cannot hear anything. Okay, so go back up to Eddie's question. So the question from Eddie Ferris was, I see a lot of what you are seeing about page objects. Do you see any other reasons outside of test setup where application actions would be useful? That's a great question. I haven't thought about that much yet. I don't think I would put it in the test, because you don't want to modify the thing you're testing. That could lead to a lot of confusion. Possibly test tear downs, though. Yeah, no, I can't think of anything beyond test setup and test tear down for that. I don't think I would do it in the test itself. If anything, it would, if you're putting something like that in the test itself, then I would ask, why are you modifying things in the middle of your test? Your test probably then needs to be broken up, because your test is probably too big. If you're modifying something in the middle of a test, then your tests aren't small enough. And so they won't read well. They could get convoluted if you're troubleshooting a test failure. So I would probably then split it up and then take that application action and put it in the test setup. I'm going through the other questions here. Let's see. Benjamin Anderson, do I have any experience writing Cypress tests in browsers that redirect across different super domains? I attempted a Cypress POC last year, but our SSO caused the tests to fail. No, I'm not sure I have experience specific with that. I do know in my previous job, we had some cross-domain issues that I was able to work through. I probably have that bookmarked somewhere. I'd have to redo that research. That was last January. But if you do run into cross-domain stuff, I do know there's some workaround stuff. I don't have experience with SSO with it. I would need to see a explicit example, but you're welcome to email me. I think my email address is in my paper. It's out somewhere. Actually, let me put it here in the chat. You're welcome to email me with some examples. I'd love to learn off of what you are also trying to do. And email's probably better, so I can actually see an example. Let's see. I think those are the questions I'm seeing. There's a link for hallway conversations. I can pop into that after the talk. Yeah, I think those are the questions that are there. But that's crazy that I can't hear you guys. Boy, that is just so frustrating. I wondered if it's because I'm using this fancy microphone, but I don't know why that would affect the audio. I'm actually going to switch off that microphone, see if it makes a difference. Oh, I see. I'm not showing my video now. So there I am. Oh, I see. I see what I did. Okay. Talk to me.
Testing.
Hear me now?
Now I can hear you guys.
Yay.
That's crazy. That would even show up. So I've got this fancy microphone, so the audio would be good. It doesn't have any speakers in it, but it shows up in Zoom under the select a speaker, and I accidentally selected that one as well.
Well, lesson learned.
Lesson learned. Yeah. Okay. Well, I had a feeling it was on my end, but could not find it. I hope you guys were all able to hear the talk fine, though.
I think so. I think, and Paul, I think there was one other question. I just recopied it back. Eddie Ferris, did you already answer his question? Do you use Cypress tags DataC?
Oh,
do you see that one?
Yes, we do. We do. I actually, when I started on this team, another team before I started at Driveway had actually started using that technique. And they introduced it to me right as I dove into our Cypress code. And I said, oh, yeah, no, that makes sense. That's all about. So for those not familiar with what he's referring to here. So this is the same thing in Selenium, actually. So when your locators are trying to locate UI elements, the best way of doing that is have an ID on those UI elements. Usually in the Selenium world, you can talk the developers into putting IDs on there. But with all these different UI front-end libraries, sometimes the IDs end up being dynamic or ended up changing. Usually the IDs aren't, but other things like the CSS, like the classes used by the CSS, for example, are often generated. So there's lots of different techniques that both Selenium and Cypress support for locating those elements, but IDs being the most reliable, except sometimes you don't have IDs because they need to be explicitly put in by developers, or sometimes, like I said, they can change dynamically depending on your how your UI, the UI tools that your developers are using. So a technique that is often done is put a custom attribute in there. I've seen it done with Selenium suites as well. It seems to be more common in the Cypress world, but DataCY means that the front-end developers put a custom attribute called DataCY into the DOM elements, and then your Cypress code always depends on that. Yes, we are doing that technique. It's definitely a best practice. So, Liz Vale, I personally use actions for logging in and tearing down. Everything else, I use the page object model. That's great. Yes, yeah. So you are doing what I'm recommending. Also, I do not use the tags. I do not like to touch the HTML and have two code bases to maintain. Just the personal preference. Okay. Yeah, I don't have experience with that.